In December of 1349, 7 men entered a breach beneath Blackthorn Castle. Only one returned. They had gone inside to rescue a 14-year-old servant who had disappeared only hours earlier. When they finally found him, the boy was still wearing the same clothes. He still carried the scar his brother had given him during childhood, but he was no longer 14. He had aged 47 years. Today, we know the Backrooms as an endless maze of faded yellow walls, damp carpet, stale, moldy air, and buzzing fluorescent lights stretching farther than any building possibly could. But long before offices, electricity, synthetic carpet, drywall, and yellow wallpaper existed, people were already disappearing into those rooms. They had no words for what they found. A Roman soldier might have called it a buried city of the gods. A Viking might have believed he had wandered beyond the 9 realms. An Egyptian tomb worker might have mistaken it for an unfinished afterlife. And the knight who returned from beneath Blackthorn Castle described it as a palace without a king, built from substances that should not yet have existed. None of them understood why a place from the modern world had been waiting for them thousands of years early. These are the stories of those who entered before history was ready to understand what they had found. This is Ancient Backrooms. The knight's name was Sir Edric Vale. He emerged from the northern wall of Blackthorn Castle's cellar 3 days after disappearing. 2 ribs were broken. His fingernails were packed with yellow fibers. His boots were filled with warm water that smelled of mold, even though the cellar floor was dry. Edric insisted he had been missing for 23 days. He spent the following 11 years documenting what happened. Every surviving copy of his testimony ends with the same warning. When the white fire falls silent, count the corners. The account began with a servant named Alwyn. A snowstorm had buried every road surrounding Blackthorn Castle, trapping more than 60 guests inside during Lord Blackthorn's winter feast. Shortly before midnight, Alwyn was sent into the lower cellar to retrieve 3 bottles of wine. He never returned. The steward found his lantern burning beside the northern wall. That section of stone had stood untouched for nearly 200 years, but one stone was missing. Behind it was not earth. It was not another cellar. It was something yellow. Lord Blackthorn ordered his masons to widen the opening. They removed 6 stones before refusing to continue. Beyond the wall stood a perfectly rectangular chamber. There were no stones inside it, no wooden supports, no pillars. The walls were covered in a thin yellow skin, faded in places and darkened by moisture in others. The floor was covered in something soft and woven, although no individual thread could be found. Warm water rose around the masons' boots whenever they stepped upon it. Long bars of white fire had been fixed inside the ceiling. They burned without flame, without smoke, without heat. They made a constant sound like thousands of insects trapped overhead. The masons called it a curse. Lord Blackthorn called it cowardice. Brother Anselm, the castle priest, stood beneath the pale bars for nearly a minute before speaking.
Brother Anselm, there is no oil, no wick, no flame, yet they shine brighter than the chapel altar. Whatever force burns above us does so without consuming anything. I do not believe this chamber was made for men.
Lord Blackthorn selected 7 men to search for Alwyn. Sir Edric Vale would lead them. Brother Anselm joined because the opening had appeared beneath consecrated ground. Garrick, captain of the lower guard, joined because he believed every mystery could be defeated with enough iron. Thomas entered because Alwyn was his younger brother. 3 guards followed them. Hugh was the eldest. He had been a mason before he ever carried a sword, and from the moment he stepped through the breach, he could not stop reading the walls. Stone he understood. He had spent his life learning what a wall could and could not do. This obeyed none of it, and that frightened him more than any of the younger men. Wat came next. Wat believed in nothing he could not strike, weigh, or sell. He had already decided the whole affair was bad air and worse wine, and he said so to anyone who would listen. Cuthbert was the youngest, barely older than Alwyn. He whistled when he was afraid, which was often. He was whistling before they had taken 10 steps. They carried swords, rope, charcoal, food, water, and enough torch oil to last until morning. Before entering, Edric tied one end of their rope around an iron ring in the cellar. He crossed through first. The soft woven ground sank beneath his boots. Warm moisture entered through the leather almost immediately. The air smelled of wet cloth, stagnant water, and mold growing somewhere without sunlight. The pale bars overhead buzzed without flickering. Edric raised his torch toward one. The flame leaned away from it. The others entered. Thomas called Alwyn's name. His voice traveled through the empty yellow chambers. Several seconds passed. Then Alwyn answered from somewhere ahead. Thomas started toward the sound. Edric stopped him. The boy called again. This time his voice came from behind them. A third call rose faintly from beneath the wet floor. Edric ordered the group back toward the cellar. The opening was gone. Their rope disappeared into a smooth section of yellow wall. When Edric pulled it, the entire length slid toward him without resistance. The other end had been severed so cleanly that the fibers appeared untouched. There had been no noise, no movement. One moment, Blackthorn Castle had been behind them. The next, there was only yellow. Garrick drove his sword into the nearest wall. The thin covering tore easily. Behind it was another identical yellow layer, then another, and another. Each layer was damp. The buzzing overhead grew louder with every cut. Garrick raised his sword again. Something scratched from deep inside the wall. The sound was not directly behind the yellow surface. It came from much farther away, as though layer after layer continued into an impossible distance. The men backed away. The chambers extended in every direction. Some were narrow enough to cross in a few steps. Others were larger than Blackthorn's great hall. Square openings led into more empty rooms without doors or hinges. There were no windows, no furniture, no hearths, no marks left by builders. It was a palace containing thousands of chambers, yet none appeared to serve a purpose. Edric marked their first passage with a black charcoal cross. They walked straight ahead for half an hour. They did not turn. They did not enter a branching passage. Yet the charcoal cross eventually appeared on a wall in front of them. Garrick accused Edric of leading them in a circle. Edric reminded him that all 7 men had watched the path. Garrick placed his sword on the wet ground with its blade pointing forward. They continued. At the 43rd opening, Garrick's sword lay across the floor ahead of them. Behind it was the same charcoal cross. They had returned to the beginning without ever turning around. Edric ordered the men closer.
Sir Edric Vale, controlled, uneasy. No one walks alone. No one follows a voice unless he can see the mouth speaking. Keep one hand upon the man beside you. Whatever these rooms are, they will not separate us without a fight.
He turned to Cuthbert last.
And no more whistling. I am sorry, lad. I know it keeps the fear off, but we may need to hear what these rooms are doing, and your song is the one thing in here loud enough to hide it.
Cuthbert stopped. The silence he left behind was worse than the tune had ever been. They moved deeper. The rooms remained almost completely empty. That emptiness made the few things they discovered feel far worse. Beneath a loose section of the wet woven floor, Brother Anselm found a footprint. It had been left by a boot, but the sole was unlike anything made by a medieval cobbler. Perfect rows of tiny squares had been pressed into the moisture. The print began in the center of the room. No footsteps approached it. None led away. In another chamber, they found a small metal key. Its teeth were thin and cut with impossible precision. The number 17 had been pressed into one side. They took it with them. Farther ahead, one of the pale bars overhead began blinking. The square panels surrounding it were not stone. They were too light, too smooth. When Garrick struck one with the flat of his sword, it lifted slightly. Something shifted in the darkness above it. The panel slowly settled back into place. Nobody looked upward again. After several hours, they found Alwyn's shoe. Thomas recognized it by a repair he had sewn into the heel, but the leather was cracked. The stitching had rotted. Yellow mold covered the sole. It looked as if it had remained there for decades. Alwyn had disappeared less than 1 day earlier. Beside the shoe, 2 warnings had been cut into the wall. The first read, "Do not follow my voice." The second read, "When the song stops, count the corners." The men looked around. 4 walls, 4 dark seams. The buzzing continued overhead. Then one of the pale fires fell silent. The remaining bars still hummed, but the room immediately felt larger. Edric looked toward the farthest corner. A shadow stood inside it. At first, it appeared no wider than the seam where the walls met. Then the light flickered. For less than a second, the shape became visible. It was tall enough for its head to press against the ceiling. Its body had been flattened into the corner. Its arms extended along both walls, bending with the shape of the room. Its fingers nearly touched the wet ground. When the light brightened, the corner was empty. Watt insisted it was exhaustion. Tired eyes and bad light, nothing more. Then the buzzing stopped in the next room. The figure appeared there, closer. The men hurried forward. From that moment on, they judged its distance by the sound overhead. When the pale fires buzzed loudly, the rooms appeared empty. When the sound weakened, the figure was near. When it stopped entirely, they refused to look behind them. They listened for the humming the way drowning men listen for a voice, and in all that listening, Cuthbert never made a sound. The boy who could not stand silence walked through it now with his jaw clenched shut, because he understood, as they all did, that his own song would drown the only warning they had. Hugh was the first to fall behind. He had stopped to press his palm flat against a wall, the way a mason tests a load he doesn't trust. There was no scream. The others heard only his sword strike the wet floor. When they returned, the weapon lay beside a corner. The woven ground around it had been pressed deeply downward, as though something impossibly heavy had stood there for a very long time. Hugh, of all of them, would have known exactly what kind of weight it took to leave a mark like that. He was not there to tell them. They continued without him. Hours later, the air changed. The smell of mold and stagnant water was replaced by sweat, blood, and human waste. Someone had built a shelter from strips torn from the yellow walls. Inside it sat an elderly man. His white hair reached his waist. His beard was tangled across his chest. His clothes had rotted into strips. Thomas almost failed to recognize him. Then the old man raised his hand. A crescent-shaped scar crossed his palm. Thomas had given Alwyn that scar when they were children. The servant they had entered to rescue was now an old man. He told them that he had wandered through the yellow rooms for 47 years. Outside, less than one day had passed.
I stopped calling for you many years ago, but my voice still comes from the passages. It calls from rooms I have never entered. Sometimes it speaks words I do not remember saying. Do not answer it. And when the humming stops, do not watch the doorways. Count the corners. If there are more than 4, the tall one is already inside.
Alwyn could barely walk. Thomas carried him. The old man guided the group using marks he had cut beneath the yellow covering, hidden where only he knew to search. He had spent decades looking for an exit. Most passages returned him to rooms he had already crossed. Some led to places he refused to describe. Once, he had followed the same corridor for nearly 3 years without finding a turn. Another time, he entered a chamber where the wet floor continued upward, across the walls and ceiling, until he could no longer tell which direction was down. But Alwyn had found one place where the tall figure never appeared. A circular room. A chamber with curved walls and no corners. Inside it was a narrow shaft that sometimes opened above Blackthorn's cellar. The group followed him. Behind them, the buzzing lights began falling silent, one after another. The darkness did not rush forward. It advanced at the slow pace of the disappearing sound. The men kept their eyes ahead. Something moved between the corners behind them without producing footsteps. At the next intersection, the humming stopped completely. Edric counted the corners. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he noticed the far wall. A narrow bend had appeared where the surface had been straight moments earlier. 5. The tall figure unfolded from the new angle. Its body was covered in the same thin yellow material as the walls. There were no eyes, no mouth, no clear division between its limbs and the surfaces behind it. Its fingers peeled slowly away from the walls. Watt finally moved.
It bleeds like a man, or it doesn't. Either way, iron settles it.
He drove his sword into the figure. The blade passed through it and struck the corner behind. The yellow surface tightened around the steel, and around the man holding it. Watt was pulled forward. His body struck the wall hard enough to crush his armor. For several seconds, his outline remained visible beneath the yellow covering, one hand still closed around a hilt that was no longer there. Then it sank deeper, until only the shape of that hand remained. Iron had settled. Nothing. The survivors ran. They passed through chambers that seemed narrower than before. Some contained 5 corners, others contained 7. A few bent into angles barely wide enough for a man to pass. Thomas struggled beneath Alwyn's weight. The old man begged to be left behind. Thomas refused. At the next opening, a long arm separated from the wall. Its hand closed around Alwyn's ankle. Thomas held his brother with both arms. For several seconds, the young man and the aged Alwyn were stretched between the center of the room and the corner. Then the yellow surface parted without tearing. Both brothers were pulled through. Their screams continued behind the wall as the others ran. Garrick disappeared next. A seam no wider than a knife blade opened between 2 walls. Something seized his armor. His body folded sideways into the narrow gap. His screams traveled ahead of the survivors for several rooms before suddenly stopping. Only Edric, Brother Anselm, and Cuthbert remained. They entered a chamber filled with square pillars. Every light was silent. The tall figure appeared in the first corner, then in the second, then the third. It did not seem to travel between them. For one impossible moment, it occupied all 3 at once. Cuthbert broke. He fled into a side passage, and a moment later his voice came back to them, bright with relief. He had found the cellar. He was certain of it. He was calling them to follow. Then the same words came again, word for word, from a different doorway. Then a third time, from a third. And beneath all of it, faint and rising, came something none of them had heard since the lights first went quiet. A whistle. The boy's tune returned to him at last, coming from every passage but the one he had run down. Edric did not follow. He and Anselm continued until the straight walls began to curve. The corners gradually disappeared. At the end of the passage stood Alwyn's circular room. Its walls were covered in the same faded yellow material. The wet, woven ground remained beneath their feet. The white fires continued humming above them, but there was not a single corner. The tall figure stopped at the entrance. Its fingers moved along the curved surface, unable to flatten themselves into an angle. In the center of the room was a dark shaft surrounded by smooth gray material. Thin iron rungs descended along one side, though they were shaped unlike any ladder Edric had seen. Far below, torchlight moved across Blackthorn's cellar. Edric shouted. The servants did not respond. The opening existed directly above them, yet they could not see it. Anselm secured their remaining rope around Edric. Behind him, the curved wall shuddered. The smooth surface began to buckle. A crease appeared. Then a narrow angle. The figure's fingers pressed into it from the passage outside. The room was no longer perfectly round.
God made the world in measures, Edric. Length, breadth. The honest corner where one wall meets the next. I have stood at an altar and preached it for 40 years. That thing in the wall is none of those. So you will write it down. The yellow, the cold fire, the wet ground, the corner that has no right to exist. You will write it even though no man will believe you. Let them not believe you. Only let them count. Now go, go, before I lose the nerve to let you.
Edric descended. The shaft stretched far deeper than the space between the yellow rooms and Blackthorn's cellar should have allowed. Above him, the circular wall continued buckling. The narrow crease widened into a corner. The tall figure unfolded inside it. Brother Anselm drew his sword. The pale fires went silent. Edric heard the priest begin a prayer. The rope went slack. Edric fell. He struck the cellar floor hard enough to break 2 ribs. Servants found him beside the northern wall. There was no shaft above him, no rope, no opening, only stone. 3 days had passed. Lord Blackthorn ordered the northern wall destroyed. The masons found nothing behind it except undisturbed earth. As soon as Edric could speak without coughing blood, he summoned 2 monks and dictated everything he remembered. He described the yellow material, the wet woven floor, the bars of cold white fire, the humming that weakened when the figure drew near. He drew the entity as a narrow human shape stretched across the corner of a room. He also recorded a thing that troubled him until the day he vanished. Of everything 7 men had carried into the yellow rooms, only one object had not come back out with him. The small steel key, the one stamped with the number 17. He searched his memory and could not say when it had left his hand. He never learned what door it had been cut to open. He wrote only that he did not believe the rooms had lost it. He believed they had kept it. At the bottom of every copy he wrote, "Count the corners before you sleep. Count them again if the humming stops." Edric never claimed the figure was a demon, ghost, or servant of hell. He wrote only what he had observed. It appeared where walls met. It did not cross the open center of a room, and it could not enter the circular chamber until the wall stopped being perfectly curved. The monks copied his testimony. Some copies were sent to distant monasteries, others were hidden because church officials feared that the account would encourage stories of witchcraft. Over time, the details changed. The pale ceiling fires became imprisoned stars. The buzzing became the song of dead insects. The yellow rooms became a forbidden kingdom beneath the earth. The tall figure became known as the Fifth Corner Man. Parents warned their children never to sleep in a newly built room before counting every angle. Builders in the villages surrounding Blackthorn refused to construct bedrooms with an uneven number of corners. A rhyme spread through the region. 4 corners belong to the room, the 5th belongs to the guest. When the pale bees cease their song, close your eyes and do not count the rest. Edric lived for 11 years after escaping. He measured every chamber before entering it. He avoided complete silence. He slept beside a burning candle so there would always be sound and movement nearby. In the summer of 1360, Edric stayed overnight at a roadside monastery. Before sleeping, he inspected his room. 4 walls, 4 corners. Nothing unusual. Shortly before dawn, another guest heard furniture moving across the stone floor. Then came the sound of fingernails scraping the wall. When the monks entered, Edric was gone. His sword lay on the ground. His bed remained pushed against the wall, but the chamber no longer possessed 4 corners. A narrow 5th angle had appeared behind the door. The stones inside it were covered with damp yellow material. The humming stopped the moment the monks entered. Edric's disappearance transformed his testimony into folklore. The original account was eventually lost. The castle collapsed. The cellar entrance was never rediscovered. But the rhyme survived, and more than 600 years later, someone repeated it again. In 2024, workers renovating an empty office building near the ruins of Blackthorn Castle removed a damaged interior wall. Behind the modern wallboard, they found medieval stone, and between the 2 surfaces was a strip of damp yellow material. The ground floor records room had always been rectangular, 4 walls and 4 corners, but the workers' final photograph showed a narrow 5th angle behind the door. That night, a security camera recorded a cleaner entering the room alone. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him as he placed his equipment beside the wall. Then the humming stopped. The man froze and began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. He turned toward the angle behind the door, and the camera distorted. For a single frame, a tall shape appeared, flattened across both walls. The cleaner was never recorded leaving. When police searched the building, the room had 4 corners again, but on the floor, beside the cleaner's abandoned equipment, an officer logged a single item no one could account for. A small steel key, machine cut, stamped on one side with the number 17. The building's locksmith said it matched no pattern made in his lifetime, and it fit no lock anywhere in the building. It had not been there when the cleaner walked in. The room had taken a man, and, as though some old accounting had finally come due, it had handed the key back. The last thing recovered was the audio. In the final seconds before the recording cut out, a man could be heard whispering a rhyme that had not been spoken in the region for generations. 4 corners belong to the room. The 5th belongs to the guest. And that is where the first surviving account from the ancient Backrooms ends. Sir Edric wrote down what he witnessed so future generations might recognize the warning, but after centuries of retelling, people forgot the yellow rooms, the wet floor, and the white fire. All that survived was the entity and the rule. When the humming stops, count the corners. What do you believe the fifth corner man actually is? Why could it not enter the circular chamber? And how did the cleaner know a rhyme whose original manuscript had been lost for centuries? Comment your theory below. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe, and share your theories. It helps Narrated Nightmares grow and lets me know you want more stories from ancient backrooms. If you have a nightmare of your own that you would like narrated, send it to narratednightmaresx@gmail.com. You've been listening to Narrated Nightmares. Until next time, lock your doors, check your mirrors, and watch the corners. And if the humming in your room suddenly stops, count the walls. Because if you find a fifth corner, do not look inside it.
You've been listening to Narrated Nightmares.